Now ready, get set at bobqc.net.
Hi readers, it's time for chapter 8 of the Sunbearer Trials by Aiden Thomas. Make sure you have your book and your highlighter pen ready to highlight along with me as I discuss the parts that I'm going to probably be making into questions and answers in the quiz next time. When I make the quiz. And when you highlight it, you'll have the page marked. So that'll come in handy if you need to make any challenges during a book battle. Know that there will be profanity in this book. So there's your warning in case there's little kids around. Okay, chapter 8. Teo found his new cabin and took a long, hot shower, per Luna's suggestion. Luckily, his back wasn't completely destroyed, and with his accelerated healing and the soothing heat, Teo felt substantially better by the time he got out of the shower. Okay, so that's what I was hoping, that because he's a semidios, he had accelerated healing. Now his ego just needed some time to recover. Teo wiped the steam from the mirror and stared at his reflection. He shook out the water from his wings. They were impossible to reach with a towel, and stretched them out. He groaned. They were always so sore from being bound all day. Teo turned side to side, trying to get a look at them in the mirror. A part of him hoped that they'd miraculously change one day, but no such luck. His feathers were still dull and brown, feminine. Okay, I'm going to stop right here. This is like in the wild, birds, usually, male birds have brighter plumage, brighter feathers. Like, I don't know, there's a woodpecker near my house, bright red, beautiful. And the female birds are more like beige and brown colors. It makes me wonder if the only problem to Teo, identifying as a male, is the wing's color, then why in the world wouldn't you just have them dyed a different color? I'd want to fly, I wouldn't want to bind them to me. I'd want to just change the color and fly. But there may be some reason for that. I don't know. I'm just wondering. Okay, here we go. His wings were a part of him, his identity and his heritage, given to him by his mom, but they never felt right, as though they belonged to someone else or he'd been given the wrong ones. Teo had to work harder than a lot of guys to get the body he was meant to have, and most of the time that didn't bother him. Testosterone was testosterone, however it got into his body. But his wings refused to get with the program. Why wouldn't they be what they were supposed to be? Why couldn't they just be his? Frustrated, Teo took out a clean uniform and retrieved his backpack. Sitting on his bed, he fished out his small bottle of testosterone and a fresh syringe. The amber liquid moved like oil as he flicked the syringe to move any air bubbles, tipped it upside down, and inserted the needle into his thigh. Giving himself his weekly dose of tea was quick and easy after doing it for so many years. Okay, so Teo is taking testosterone in order to present as a male, as he identifies, as he feels. When he was finished, Teo slapped on a Band-Aid and went to go find his friends. Naya had saved them a spot on some lounge chairs out on the deck. Teo listened while she and Shio sat together, flipping through the binder of trading cards with a look of intense concentration. As the major gold city, La Cumbre wasn't far from the entrance to Soul City, but it was taking them forever to get there. I'm going to highlight that it was a major gold city. He suspected the slow speeds were for show. As they coasted down the river, people stood along the banks, causeways, and bridges, waving and cheering like it was some kind of parade. Teo would have thought that Aristella and Aurelio would have been eating up all the attention, but instead they were lying out on the large sunken couch, soaking up the sun. Aristella's eyes were closed, her foot bouncing to whatever music she was listening to on her phone, while Aurelio watched something on his. It was actually Acela who raced back and forth along the railing, waving at their audience. Whenever they triumphantly raised their hands over their head, the cheering swelled. Atsi, Shoshi, and Desi ran around the bow of the boat, trying to evade Marino as he sprayed them with jets of water he pulled from the river. Atsi used a fancy gold tray to protect her hair, while Soshi danced out of Marino's reach. They laughed, shouted, and chased each other, seemingly without a care in the world. Were they all so confident about the trials that none of them were the least bit worried? The dread in his stomach kept getting heavier the farther they got from Soul Temple. It made him feel like he was walking through mud by the time they went to the upper deck for lunch. Everyone else was wide awake and hyper, talking animatedly and laughing. The only other person who seemed rightfully worried was Shio. He plopped into the seat next to Teo and stared intently at his plate of food, but didn't touch a thing. Teo wanted to reassure him, but right now he couldn't even reassure himself. Soon, they'd be competing in their first trial, and Teo was starting to worry whether he could make it through one, let alone 5. So now we know that there's 5 trials. I didn't remember that from before. He couldn't even lift a weight without fucking up. How was he supposed to compete with the elite golds who had the advantage of training for the trials with professional heroes? Teo was pulled from his catastrophizing when an errant stream of water meant for Desi hit Aurelio and Aristella. Aurelio flinched, but Aristella gasped loudly and leapt to her feet. Atsi, Soshi, Desi, and Marino all froze, realizing their grave mistake. Aristella turned on them, her pristine ponytail now a sopping mess. She bared her teeth and clenched her hands into fists. The water on her skin sizzled and evaporated into wisps of steam. Desi clamped his hands over his mouth, eyes wide with alarm. "Scatter!" Marino shouted and signed. It must be a big, huge deal because they're fire dioses for water to hit them. Okay, so the water, I'm highlighting that the water hit Aristella. And I'm thinking for the future, if I were a Jade, I'd be thinking, how can I use water against Aristella and Aurelio? Kind of like the Wicked Witch of the West in The Wizard of Oz. I'm melting. Okay. Desi, she can't kill us after all. So she followed up before grabbing Asi's small hand and making a run for it. "Watch me!" Aristella roared. As the other 4 scrambled to get away, Aurelio shook the water out from the speakers of his phone. When it seemed to be working, he sat back and watched Aristella terrorize the others. Aurelio had a pinched and unsure expression on his face. It was one Teo had seen many times when they were little kids and Aurelio wanted to play with the others but didn't know how to start. Back then, Teo would just have grabbed his arm and pulled him into whatever game it was. Watching him now, he wondered if Aurelio and Aristella's tendency to keep to themselves was by design, or if, despite his celebrity status, Aurelio hadn't changed as much as he thought. "What are you watching?" Teo asked him from across the deck, surprising both Naya and Shio. Aurelio blinked. "Me?" "No, the guy behind you." Aurelio turned. "Yes, you." "Baking videos." He's watching baking videos, Aurelio replied, wiping the screen dry on his shirt. Teo squinted at him, unable to tell if he was being sarcastic. Aurelio responded with an arched eyebrow. Teo huffed, "Fine, don't tell me." That was what he got for trying to make small talk. Around them, the terrain grew hillier as the mountains in the distance gradually got closer. "Are we there yet?" Shio asked Naya, who nodded enthusiastically, a wide smile brightening her face. "Nearly. We'll be disembarking soon," Luna said, appearing at the door. Aristella stood with her fists on her hips, both Marino and Desi pinned under her foot. Soshi and Atsi peeked out from behind a lounge chair where they had taken refuge. Luna squinted at them, but decided not to ask. "Please head back to your rooms to make yourselves presentable," she said. Teo's stomach clenched. "Once we disembark, we are heading straight for the first trial." Okay. This is just a pause. I think Aurelio really was watching baking videos. I think maybe he wants to bake, or he likes to bake. So I don't think he was being sarcastic. That's just my guess. Tucked into the northwestern mountain range of Reino del Sol, La Cumbre was gorgeous and unlike any city Teo had ever seen. Its name referred to the large dormant volcano, highlighting that the city was built against, at the top of which sat Tierra's temple. Teo, okay, I'm going to put Tierra's temple sat at the top of the dormant volcano. Teo had never seen mountains so big and up so close. The buildings were tucked into the mountainside, carved into the stone, and there were a lot fewer trees than he'd imagined. The city shone, gold plating and silver trimmings glittering in the waning sunlight. Small paths zigzagged their way up the steep mountainside. The roads themselves weren't paved, but were made of soft, packed dirt. The Golds chatted among themselves up ahead, placing their bets on what the first trial would be. Meanwhile, Naya and Teo hung back, Shio walking between them. "I hope it's a race," said Shoshi, readjusting the flowers that she'd taken from a bouquet in the kitchen and put in her hair. "I bet it's hand-to-hand combat," was Aristella's enthusiastic guess. "I want to fight a Dios," Ocello announced, punching their fist into their palm. They're not going to do that after what happened 90 years ago," Aurelio said, voice edged with annoyance. Teo shot Naya a concerned look over Shio's head. "What happened 90 years ago?" "Oh, competitors had to fight Diosa Culebra, but she got a little overexcited," highlighting they had to fight Diosa Culebra. Naya explained with a shrug as if it were common knowledge. Ended up constricting 3 competitors and breaking their spines. Oh my gosh. Okay. She snapped her fingers right in half. "Dios," Teo hissed under his breath. "I've never heard about that." "Part of the curriculum at the academy is learning about all past trials," Naya explained. "We use them as practice exercises." "Great. Just another gold advantage." "Bummer, though," Naya sighed. "It'd be pretty cool to be able to say I fought a Dios." Teo gave her a bewildered look. "You Golds are out of control." Shio remained silent at his side, staring straight ahead and not blinking in a way that made Teo nervous. He might pass out before they got to their destination. He needed not to let his own nerves get the better of him for Shio's sake. If he started panicking, then Shio would too, and that wouldn't do either of them any good walking into the first trial. He'd have to keep his expressions in check and push his worries down deep where they could later manifest as a stomach ulcer or something. "Don't be scared," Teo said quietly so the Golds wouldn't overhear. "I'm not." But Shio's voice was tight as he continued to stare ahead. Teo and Naya exchanged worried glances. The streets of the city were full of spectators lined up to watch them arrive. Tierra's glyph, highlighting Tierra's glyph, 3 mountains with the sun rising behind each of them. Behind them, not behind each of them. It's like there's 3 suns. No. Tierra's glyph, 3 mountains with the sun rising behind them. Adorned lampposts and altars to the god of earth were set outside businesses. Naya was clearly the crowd favorite. She had a huge smile plastered across her face as she waved, practically bouncing with excitement. Larger-than-life posters of Naya hung in shop windows, and massive murals were painted onto the sides of buildings. Apparently, Chisme worked faster than Teo had realized, because when they rounded a corner, he was horrified to find a line of all 10 competitors' portraits taped up on the large windows of a grocery store. So I'm going to highlight that on the windows of a grocery store in La Cumbre, that's the first time that Teo sees his own photo taken by Chisme and Verdad posted. The Golds looked like professional athletes who modeled all the time, posed, smiling and powerful. Even Shio looked great, if a bit uncomfortable. His chin was raised and he stared right into the camera with a fierce look of determination. Meanwhile, Teo's poster on the far left was downright painful to look at. The uniform seemed even tighter on him than in the mirror, and his face was pinched into a weird grimace, his hands in tight fists at his sides. A humiliated blush burned Teo's cheeks, and he tried to duck behind Naya, hoping no one would recognize him. "We are about to enter the arena," Diosa Luna announced, and signed as they walked up to a huge circular stadium. "Get into a single file line and follow me inside. Your parents will be waiting for you. Please join them, and I'll go over the rules before we get started," she said with a smile. Teo took one last shaky breath before following the others through the looming arches. They entered a long tunnel. What felt like thousands of voices bounced against the stone walls. When they stepped out into the arena, cheers from the crowd exploded. The space was as massive as it was ancient. Weathered stone stadium seating surrounded the outer edge of the arena. Scattered amid the La Cumbre residents waving posters of Naya were pockets of other priests and semidioses proudly representing their home cities, everyone grouped with colorful robes and banners. White flags rippled through the stands, mostly displaying Tierra's glyph, but Teo could see other gold competitors all had supporters as well. Among the sea of white, there wasn't a single jade flag. Teo wasn't surprised, but it still stung. The only spot of blue and purple was in the far upper corner where Quetzal and Mala Suerte's priest sat. A huge screen dominated the stands, displaying Chisme in a chair on the right, while Verdad was on the left. Chisme was decked out in a white cotton outfit with an excessive amount of gold jewelry, including large hoop earrings. But Verdad wore the same boring black and white suit. Verdad's expression was serious, while Chisme's was overly animated, but Teo couldn't hear what he was saying over the noise of the crowd. The promotional images of the competitors swiped across the screen one at a time. Normally, having a 30-foot-tall, painfully awkward image of himself on display in front of tens of thousands of people would have been enough to send him spiraling, but there was something even more dire. Rising up from a body of water in the center of the stadium was a craggy mountain. Steeply pitched, it was covered in lush tropical plants and trees. Tiny cascades of water fell in intervals, cutting through switchbacks that led up the steep face of the mountain. At the very top, a boulder-sized slab of gold carved with Sol's glyph sat gleaming in the sunlight. The full stands and towering peak were dizzying. Teo did his best to keep walking forward as vertigo sent his legs wobbling. Shio followed Naya with determined steps. Okay, so a big mountain rose up in the center of the stadium, and it had waterfalls and plants all over it. Okay. Aurelio and Aristella had already turned on the charm as they walked out into the stadium. Aristella smiled and waved while her brother lifted one hand, his mouth arranged in a smile, his eyes sharp and focused. The crowd welcomed the competitors with cheers as Luna led them to a platform where the dioses waited. Aurelio and Aristella took their places on either side of their mother, as if standing guard, while Desi ran the last few steps to his mom. Amor, the beautiful and full-figured goddess of love and community, swept him into a hug. So I'm highlighting that Desi, his mother, is Amor. She's a god, the beautiful and full-figured goddess of love and community. When they broke apart, they signed animatedly to each other with matching apple-cheeked smiles. As everyone split off to join their parents, Teo focused on his breathing as he crossed over to his mom. He felt outside of his own body, like it was on autopilot, and he was just along for the ride. He thought seeing her would calm him down, but she looked just as anxious as he felt. "Are you okay?" she asked, hugging him tight. "Yes," Teo lied. When she released him, he stood close by her side, looking anywhere but at the overwhelming crowd. His throat was tight, the neck of his uniform suffocating. To his left, Shio was with his dad. Mala Suerte's expression was stony and unfriendly as he stood still as a statue, his hand on Shio's shoulder. "Welcome to the Tepital," Luna called. I'm highlighting Tepital, even though I don't know yet what it is. In a magnified voice as she stepped forward. The roaring cheers dulled to a low hum. Dios Mariachi, smiling in his white suit and brass cornet in hand, stood to her right, and a familiar figure stood to her left. It was strange seeing Fantasma out in broad daylight. Okay, so Mariachi's on her right and Fantasma's on her left. Usually she didn't show up to events until nightfall, and then she spent most of the time as a wallflower hanging out in the shadows. It was obvious to Teo that this wasn't in her comfort zone either. Her hands fidgeted as nervously as the butterflies around her. Butterflies are around Fantasma. But for Teo, seeing her was a relief, a friend in an otherwise unfriendly place, even if Fantasma was a morbid reminder of the trial's stakes. Teo smiled at her, and she wiggled her fingers in a tiny wave with the slightest quirk of her lips. She's so creepy. Aristella stared at Fantasma, her mouth twisted in disgust. Why does she never talk? Highlighting that Fantasma never talks. Ocello snorted. I heard she doesn't have a tongue. Probably eaten by maggots, Aristella replied. Aurelio glanced over at his sister. He frowned, a deep crease between his eyebrows, and for a second, Teo thought he might actually grow a pair and say something. But no, instead he looked away, his attention focused back on Luna as he tapped his armband again. I'm going to highlight, he keeps on tapping his armband. I don't know if that's just a nervous thing he does or if it's doing something. Angry heat flushed through Teo. He clenched his hands into fists. Nostrils flared as he tried to focus on what Luna was saying instead of picking a fight. The object of this trial is to race to the top of the mountain. Okay, I'm highlighting that. That's why there's a big mountain that just rose up in the middle of the stadium, because they're all going to have to race up it. Diosa Luna explained and signed, her voice amplified by a mic. Along the way, there will be 10 markers with your city's glyph, including the final one at the top. You must activate them by touch, one at a time, as you race to the finish. I'm highlighting this. Each competitor has a separate but identical path with obstacles along the way. So there's obstacles. If you don't reach the top in time, or if you step into another competitor's path, it will negatively affect your ranking, Luna warned. Okay, I'm going to highlight all this. So obviously this isn't a pass or fail situation. It's these challenges will be adding or subtracting points. I guess it'll be determined at the end who loses and gets sacrificed. I smell a loophole, Aristella murmured to Ocello. Teo rolled his eyes. Competitors have 10 minutes to reach the top of the mountain, highlighting 10 minutes to reach the top of the mountain. Luna explained as Soul Priestess handed each of them a black rubber watch. That's weird. A black rubber watch. When Teo put it on his wrist, it buzzed, and the face flashed his mother's glyph. There is a barrier at the finish point. When you cross it, you lock in your position and will not be able to leave until the trial is over. Okay, when you get to the top, you get locked in there till everybody else is done, and it's over. 10 minutes? The mountain looked about as tall as the Quetzalcoatl Temple, which he easily climbed every day, but this was a mountain with obstacles, whatever the hell that meant. Teo's mind raced to come up with a strategy. The mountain looked like one of his favorite reality shows. A reality show, Secrets of the Lost Temple. Competitors attempted to complete a series of obstacle courses of increasing difficulty up a fake mountain. Teo used to be obsessed with it when he was little. When he thought about it like that, the trial was a little less scary. It was basically the same thing, except it was an actual mountain, and instead of foam and padded edges, it ended in steep cliffs and rugged terrain. Teo swallowed hard. How difficult could it be? They crossed a bridge to the base of the mountain, where each competitor's glyph was on the ground, equidistant from one another. It was easy to make out the switchbacks of his own path up the side. The first glyph to activate sat at the entrance, a carved piece of jade about the size and shape of a headstone. Okay, so a carved piece of jade about the size of a headstone, that's his glyph to activate and start the race for him. A little too on the nose, if you ask Teo, meaning that it kind of looked like a headstone. He was a little worried. He couldn't see Naya, but to his left, Ocello separated him and Shio, and to his right, Atsi stood poised on the balls of her feet with Aristella on her other side. So much for teaming up with his friends. See, they're all separated, so that's going to make that hard. Teo tried to mirror Atsi's starting position, as if that would give him some kind of edge, and shook out his arms. He just needed to stay on his path, activate all of his glyphs, and get to the top without getting disqualified. On your marks, Luna amplified voice echoed. Teo's jade glyph pulsed with light, and his watch buzzed with the same beat. Get set. Mariachi's cornet trumpeted. I'm going to highlight that Mariachi's got a cornet, which is a horn. The Quetzal glyph flashed at the same time the watch made a long buzz. Teo ran. As soon as he hit the first glyph, it glowed with bright jade green light, and his watch gave a short vibration. The terrain of the mountain alternated between rocky and lush. Rocky and lush, meaning lush like lots of plants. A waterfall started somewhere far up above and ran perpendicular to his path. Teo sloshed through the water on each switchback, the stream growing stronger the higher he went. Teo ran as quickly as he could, but by the time he got to the second switchback and slapped the next glyph, his lungs burned. He wasn't a runner. It didn't agree with his binder, and he didn't know a damn thing about maintaining his pace. So I'm going to highlight his lungs burned. He wasn't a runner, didn't agree with his binder. A loud noise jolted Teo out of his focus. Higher on the mountain, Atsi and Aristella duked it out from their respective sections. Aristella kept lobbing balls of fire at Atsi, who deflected by conjuring up thick sheets of rain with a swipe of her arm. The water sizzled and steamed on impact. Okay, I'm going to highlight that Aristella kept lobbing balls of fire at Atsi. And Atsi made sheets of rain so that she wouldn't be hurt by the fire. So obviously they're allowed to interfere with each other as long as they don't actually get physically in the way. That disqualifies you if you get in the way of the other person's path. But they can distract or interfere with each other on the way. I also am going to guess that they're going to underestimate the two Jades, Teo and Shio, and probably concentrate most of their efforts interfering with the other golds because they think they're more of a challenge, which actually is an advantage for the Jades. You take advantage of someone else underestimating you. When she had an opening, a crackling bolt of lightning materialized in Atsi's hand, electric and shuddering, before she threw it at Aristella like a spear. Okay, so now Atsi threw a lightning spear at Aristella. Aristella narrowly avoided the bolt. It crashed into a tree with a thundering crack, splitting it in half. Teo was so hilariously, terrifyingly out of his league. The golds had real powers and strength. Even small Atsi could easily kick his ass if she wanted to. She could hurl lightning bolts with her hands for soul's sake. At least they were keeping one another busy. On the third switchback, Teo hit his first obstacle. The path suddenly ended, and Teo, distracted by the battle overhead, almost went right over the edge. I'm going to highlight that. He was distracted by the other two fighting, and he almost went right over the edge of a cliff. He skidded to a stop, arms pinwheeling, and threw himself against the craggy side of the mountain. Sharp stones dug into his wings. A sheer cliff separated him from the next glyph, his foot mere inches from a steep drop. The stream of the waterfall trailed down the open space to the switchback far below. Shit, he hissed, gulping down air. How was he supposed to get across? Precious moments ticked away as he tried to come up with a plan. He couldn't fly. He hadn't used his wings since he was little, and now was not the time to experiment. I'm going to highlight this. Hadn't flown since he was little. Doesn't know how to fly, really. He sure as shit wasn't going to attempt to jump it, semidios or not. Frantically, he looked around for something to help him. There were plenty of trees, but going straight up wouldn't do him any good because he still needed to activate the glyph on the other side of the gap. But there was a thick branch that extended out with a thick vine hanging from it just in reach. Highlighting. Teo grabbed hold and gave it 3 sharp yanks to make sure it would take his weight. He'd used rope swings along the banks of the canals in summertime. It couldn't be much more difficult than that, right? Before he could second guess himself, Teo held on for dear life and with a running leap swung out across the drop. He clenched his teeth, holding back a shout, and released the vine when he was over solid ground. Gracelessly, he landed on his butt, but he didn't fall to his death, so he'd take the bruises. Yes, he shouted, punching his fist into the air. He hit the next glyph, and his watch gave him another short buzz. There was a gust of air as something large flew right over his head. A boulder smashed into the tree he'd just swung from. Highlighting this, branch, vine, and stone crumbled down the side of the mountain. Teo swung around in time to see another flying right for his head. Quickly, he dropped to the ground. The boulder smashed into the cliff face, rubble showering down around him. Teo choked on dirt and grime, pushing himself up onto his knees. Through a gap in the trees, he could see Ocello standing menacingly, hefting a large rock in their burly arms. You missed, Teo shouted, fueled by spite. Okay, so I'm highlighting that it's Ocello who's throwing boulders at Teo. Ocello chucked the rock. Teo threw himself between the 2 large boulders, narrowly avoiding the projectile. Teo poked his head out from his hiding spot and smirked. He'd have thought a gold would have better aim. Are you angry because you're so short? He called out. Ocello bared their teeth. Teo did what he knew every bully hated to be on the receiving end of. He laughed. Short and sharp, highlighting that he laughed. Every bully hates to be laughed at. Ocello slammed their fist into a tree, splintering its trunk. They drew in a deep breath, their chests swelling, growing, changing. They tipped their head back and released a bellow. No, not a bellow, but a roar. Ocello's body changed, their muscles growing and rippling under their skin, hulking out like some kind of luchador. Their nails morphed into claws. I'm highlighting this. So he's growing. Nails morphed into claws. And 4 heavy canines protruded from their mouth. When Ocello bared their teeth, their amber eyes bulged. Teo immediately regretted everything. How could he compete with this? Overhead, Mariachi's cornet rang out, and Teo's watch gave 2 short buzzes, announcing someone had reached the finish. Seriously? Teo craned his neck, but the top of the mountain was still far out of sight. How had someone made it already? Apparently, having the same thought, Ocello gave him one last snarl before rushing off. Teo needed to hurry. The higher he went, the steeper the terrain became. Not long after the 4th glyph, the waterfall crashed over the path. Even in his fancy new shoes, Teo's feet slid on the slick stones and moss as he crossed to the next glyph and activated. Buzz! On the next switchback, the path was gone, replaced instead by jagged rocks. Okay, I'm going to put that this last obstacle was the waterfall itself. And now, jagged rocks are protruding straight up into the air. Okay, that's this next obstacle. It looked like the tops had been sliced off so they could act as stepping stones, but they weren't close enough to step from one to the other. If Teo was going to cross, he'd have to jump between them, but they were barely larger than his foot and wet from the waterfall. Can you imagine this? Like pointy, just really jagged, pointy things sticking up, kind of like stalagmites sticking up, you know? And he's going to have to jump from one to the other and just balance on the top tip of each pointy point. Adrenaline was working against him, making it hard for Teo to focus. On top of that, he was short of breath and his legs were dangerously unsteady. 2 short trumpets of the cornet cut through the air. Buzz, buzz. He didn't have time to think. He just needed to go. Teo ran and leapt for the first stone. His foot hit true. There was no time to hesitate. If he slowed down, he could lose his balance. So Teo used the momentum and jumped to the next stone one leg at a time. This also reminds me of people when they try to get across like floating things or logs, and so they just have to kind of keep going without stopping, or else they'll sink. He was nearly to the other side when the cornet startled him. Buzz, buzz. Teo's foot slipped. Okay, I'm going to highlight that that's what made him slip. He heard the cornet again. He's almost to the other side, and it made him slip. As he launched himself from the final stone, he sucked in a breath. His body pitched forward. Teo stretched out his arms, desperately trying to reach for the outcropping. His chest slammed into the edge, crushing the air from his lungs. His ribs exploded with pain. Legs dangled over the jagged rocks down below. Teo started to slip. Okay, so he's hanging on above the jagged rocks. Panic squeezed his heart in an icy grip. He scrambled desperately, clawing his way to stable ground, but the mud slipped between his fingers. A strangled shout caught in his throat as his chin dragged painfully over rock. He kicked his legs wildly, trying to get leverage. Finally, his foot caught on a protruding rock. Oh, thank Dios. With all his might, Teo pushed off. The rock crumbled under his foot, but he was able to throw himself forward. Kicking and crawling on his arms, Teo got himself back on solid ground. Covered in mud, he collapsed onto his back, staring up into the lush canopy. His heart thudded painfully as he gulped down air, but the cornet trumpeted again. Buzz, buzz. Teo smacked his sixth glyph, buzz, and pressed on to activate the seventh, buzz. Then he reached the apex of the waterfall. It flowed from an unknown source within the mountain and spilled out from a hollow space between jutting rocks, thundering down onto the path below. This time, the glyph was nestled within the waterfall, highlighting this, in a small cave. Teo could barely glimpse the jade stone through the frothy cascade. Carefully, Teo edged closer. Water sprayed his face, stinging his skin and obscuring his vision. The rush was unrelenting. When he stepped too close, the force of it nearly shoved his foot out from underneath him. I'm wondering how Stella and Aurelio are doing with this, having to stick their arm through water. Teo turned and pressed his body against the cliff face. With his right hand, he wedged his fingers deep into the nearest crevice. Pressing his cheek into the wet stone, he leaned out, blindly reaching with his left hand. The second he tried to reach through it, the water violently shoved his arm out of the way, with such force it nearly tossed him off the ledge. Gritting his teeth, Teo tried again. This time, he pressed his palm flat against the mountainside, sliding it behind the waterfall so it wouldn't knock him away again. He stretched as far as he could, and finally his fingers touched the smooth surface of jade. Behind the water, the eighth glyph lit up. Buzz! The path ended at the waterfall, so he needed to find another way up the rest of the mountain. With only one glyph before the final at the top, it was now so steep he'd essentially have to climb. Teo tried to catch his breath as he scoped out the best path, cold water dripping from his hair and down the back of his neck. It was mostly boulders and sharp outcroppings. He could see the ninth glyph sitting on a flat sheet of rock. Above it was another 15 feet or so of rocky cliff face before the summit of the mountain. There were distant voices, and Teo could even see the top of Sol's glyph undulating with golden light. He was almost there. He still had time. He needed to keep pushing forward. With trembling hands and shaky breath, Teo climbed. Sharp stone bit his fingertips, drawing beads of jade blood as he grasped for handholds, wedging his foot between some rocks. The heavy, humid air did little to cool him down, and the smell of earthy moss filled his lungs. Dragging his chest over unyielding stone, he pulled himself higher up the cliff's face. The 9th glyph was nearly in reach now, the jade just a few inches away. If he stretched, he could probably hit it. Desperately, Teo pushed off with his foot, but the rock supporting him gave way. This is right before the 9th one. A yelp lodged in Teo's throat. Choking on dirt, he held on for dear life as gravel shifted and slid. Overhead, he heard Naya's voice call out, "Teo!" He looked up. Ocello had made it to the top of the mountain. Instead of crossing the barrier that marked the finish, they stood on the very edge of the platform, a large piece of slate hefted in their arms. So Ocello's not even hurrying to finish himself. He wants to stand there and sabotage Teo. Teo's heart stopped. Ocello grinned. Their eyes black as pits. They chucked the slate, and Teo flinched, but Ocello didn't throw the chunk of rock at him. Instead, it crashed into the section to Ocello's right, Shio's path. Teo saw him curled up in a ball and wedged between two boulders, covering his head as rocks shifted and clattered down around him. The rock face splintered and crumbled under Shio's hands, and he fought to keep a grip. Fear and anger warred inside Teo. Ocello was ruthless and so strong, there was nothing Shio could do to defend himself. Instead of just finishing the trial, Ocello wanted to fuck with him. So I'm going to highlight that Ocello, I thought he was throwing it at Teo too, but he was throwing it into Shio's path. Man, Ocello's a jerk. That was me, not Teo. He probably agrees. Okay. Teo needed to do something and not helplessly cling to the cliffside. He couldn't cross over to Shio's section to help him because then they'd both get their scores docked. But if he did nothing, Ocello was going to crush Shio under a rock slide. If he wanted to help Shio, he'd have to stop Ocello. Ocello, the half-jaguar god, demigod, Ocello, the half-jaguar gold demigod who could hurl whole boulders the size of donkeys. There was no way to even the playing field. He couldn't beat Ocello hand-to-hand, but maybe he could outsmart him. Teo had a secret weapon, if he was willing to use them. Aha! They were the only leg up he had of these trials, especially this one. It was practically made for a flying competitor to dominate. I was thinking that at the very beginning, having to get to the top. I thought how handy that would be. Even if you couldn't just fly right to the top, you could at least propel yourself. Okay. As Ocello hefted another slab of stone, Teo's anger and determination won out. I really hope this works, Teo thought, as he summoned every ounce of strength he had left. Teo strained his wings as hard as he could. His binder ripped and popped as they broke free and extended. With no time to second-guess himself, Teo flapped his wings down forcefully and propelled himself to the next outcropping. He overshot it a little, crashing into the cliff and sliding down to where he'd been trying to land. His neglected muscles screamed and seared with white-hot pain, so it hurts badly to use his wings because he hasn't been using them. Like when you stand up and your legs been asleep and it hurts. But Teo pushed through it, beating his wings once, twice. By the third, he was up in the air, flying up the side of the mountain. Ocello froze with the boulder held over their head. Shock flashed across their face. They shook their head roughly, as if clearing their vision, and when they looked back up, Ocello's yellow-green eyes were wide and confused. As Teo shot past them, he twisted his hips and struck Ocello's head with the inside of his foot like it was an ugly soccer ball. Highlighting. Ocello fell back, which was good, but the sudden shift sent Teo tumbling through the air. Desperately, Teo tried to regain his balance, pinwheeling his arms and trying to flap his wings. He managed to right himself, and when he looked back, Ocello was sitting in the dirt, dazed, as a line of gold blood slid down the corner of their mouth. He did it. He'd stopped Ocello, and he was flying. Teo hadn't done this since he was little. Waymack and his mom were always worried about him getting hurt, which made sense because he had so little control over his wings when he was small. He could only ever get a few feet off the ground, but that was before he had fully matured. Teo had given up on using his wings when his body started to change. He had no idea of how good it would feel to stretch his wings out and fly. For a moment, he just breathed, relishing the air rushing over him. The sensation of flying filled his chest in euphoria, so much so that Teo found himself laughing. But now he needed to focus. He was still in the middle of a trial and needed to make sure Shio was okay. Holy shit, Teo! Naya shouted at him from the top of the mountain, a huge smile plastered across her face. She was standing next to Sol's glyph behind a shimmering barrier that must have been the finish point. Soshi, Aristella, and Aurelio stood next to her. They seemed stunned. The ever-stoic Aurelio's lips were actually parted as he stared up at Teo. I wonder if they even knew he had wings. Probably not, I guess. What? Teo shouted back through strained huffs. He was quickly running out of breath, his body feeling heavier with every beat of his wings. Look at your wings! Naya screamed, jumping up and down. In the thrill of flying, for once, Teo hadn't thought about what his wings looked like. He'd spent so much time trying to avoid the sight in his periphery and mirrors. Now, he hesitantly glanced over his shoulder and let out a surprised yelp. His wings were no longer the familiar sight he'd spent every morning hiding. They weren't brown and patchy. Now, brilliant, ultramarine, iridescent blue, and electric green feathers sprang from his back. The feathers of a proper male quetzal. You guys, look at my arm. When I get really, can you see? Before it goes down, I got goosebumps. Also, that's the end, by the way, of chapter 8. Wow, this is getting really exciting. I was also thinking, I'm always thinking, reminded of different stories and different things when I read, which is a good thing. I don't know if you've ever heard of this before, but when I was teaching, teachers learned about teaching our students while they're reading to make connections. Because when you're making connections, you see something when you're reading and you think, oh, that makes me think of something else. It actually helps in your comprehension and it helps you remember it better. So there's 3 kinds. There's text to world connections. That's when you're reminded of something that you've heard about that's happened to somebody in the world. Text to self, a connection that reminds you of something that has happened to you. And text to text, something that you've read or, read about somewhere else in another book. So The Wizard of Oz is a book. When I said, I'm melting, and that was the witch melting from the water. That's really a text-to-text connection. So I have another one. Ocello. I wonder if he even made it to the top within 10 minutes, because he spent a lot of time there trying to sabotage Shio. I'm hoping not. I don't know yet, but they only had 10 minutes. And what the text-to-text connection that this makes me think of is the tortoise and the hare, because Ocello thinks he's so fast and so strong, no problem. So he's going to waste time and mess with Shio, and he ends up sabotaging himself because he didn't expect what happened with Teo. So, cool. All right. So this is the end of chapter 8. Keep reading.
You read the books, now ready, get set. BOBQB.net. You read the books, now ready, get set. BOBQC.net. now ready, get set. BOBQC.net. You read the books, now ready, get set. BOBQC.net.